Hello, my name is Valerie. Now, if you're looking at this on Thursday the 25th, that's the day when the church commemorates St. Mark the Evangelist, the man who wrote the Gospel. What do we know about Mark? Well, not all scholars agree, but it's quite likely that the Mark who wrote the Gospel is the same man as the John Mark who appears several places in the Acts of the Apostles and in St. Paul's epistles. From them we learn that his mother owned a house in Jerusalem, and that house was the hub where the early Christians used to meet, and is quite likely the place where the Last Supper was held, with the disciples meeting in the upper room there, and also that it would be the place where the risen Jesus first appeared to the disciples. Where was Mark when all of this was going on? It's thought that he was a young man, perhaps a teenager at that time, and so he must have been at least on the fringes of everything that was happening. And my guess is that with the enthusiasm and vision of young people, he would have been fascinated by Jesus, by his actions and his teaching, and longing to be part of the inner group that was meeting in his mother's house. And he's left us an intriguing little clue about his involvement in his gospel. It comes as the disciples have left the house after the Last Supper to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where the soldiers come to arrest Jesus. And this is what Mark writes. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. That's all. None of the other Gospels have this little story. So isn't it likely that without wanting to draw too much attention to himself, this is Mark's way of saying, I was there. I saw what happened, but like the others, I was frightened and ran away. I like to imagine that the young John Mark had been at the Last Supper, perhaps helping out, but also watching and listening. And then perhaps he'd got a bit tired or bored with all the talk. He went to bed. And then he heard the bustle of everyone leaving the house. He was curious, so he hastily grabbed something to put on and followed them out into the darkness. And we know what happened next. Was he there in the upper room to see the risen Jesus? Well, we don't know. But what we can work out is that over the next number of years, he must have been part of that inner group of trusted disciples in Jerusalem, because when Paul and Barnabas decided to go on a missionary journey together, Barnabas, who was Mark's cousin, wanted to take him with them as a helper. Well, they went to Cyprus and amazing things happened there. You can read about them in the Acts of the Apostles. But then as they were journeying on, the young Mark decided to leave them, to go home. Something that wasn't viewed with favour by the two others. We don't know why he went, but he was letting them down badly. And the next time that the two of them plan another missionary journey and Barnabas wants to give his cousin a second chance, Paul is having none of it. And that leads to a nasty rift between the two men, such that they go their separate ways. We do meet Mark again, though. It's most likely in the 60s now, the first century, about 30 years after Jesus' ministry. Paul is writing letters from prison, and he refers to John Mark in very positive terms as someone who's a big help to him. So the rift has been healed. Sources outside the New Testament also tell us that Mark spent a lot of time with St. Peter, and from him learned all the stories of Jesus that Peter had been an eyewitness of. And then after Peter's death, Mark wrote them down, most likely in the late 60s. Now, if you've ever wondered if the gospel records can be accurate, being written years after the events, think of your own life for a minute. If you're in your 50s or more, or know someone who is, you'll know that events that took place 30 or 40 years ago can still be very vivid in the mind. I certainly remember key events from the mid-1980s very clearly. And when you tell people these stories, and let's face it, we do tend to tell the same stories over and over a bit, don't we? You find yourself using the same words each time. And so there's Mark hearing Peter telling these stories over and over to the different people he meets. And so it's likely that when Mark comes to write the stories down, he'll find himself using exactly the same words that Peter had used. So his gospel is that close to the actual events that took place. Tradition has it that Mark then went on to Egypt and established the church there, becoming the first bishop of Alexandria, an important city. What a rich life he had. And I expect in his later years he'd have looked back over everything that had happened, and I wonder which part of it all he would have considered the most important, where he thought God had used him most. Quite possibly it wouldn't have been writing that short book. But we know that however important his missionary work was, it is that little book that God has used to bring countless millions of people to know and love Jesus, and that it's still happening nearly 2,000 years later. Or we can look back over our own lives, the good things and the things we might prefer to forget. But what we can't always know is how God has used us through all of it. Perhaps something we hardly remember will have had a big impact on someone's life. Perhaps something we don't even recognise as God's gift to us is what he's using for his purposes in ways we may never know in this world. The important thing is that we should just try to be faithful to what seems to be the way we can serve God from day to day, while being open to anything new that comes along that seems to be God's will for us. And that's what we thank St. Mark for doing when he took time out from his busy life to write his gospel, the good news about Jesus.